One evening at a fancy restaurant in New York, in the noisy kitchen, the young chefs looked down on the new old chef, giving him menial tasks. They sneered when he suggested cooking a dish. Just then, a powerful guest, a famous tech billionaire, came to dinner. He ordered many dishes, but accidentally tried a small dish that the old chef had cooked silently. When he tasted it, he immediately stopped, his eyes completely changed. The taste evoked deep memories. The billionaire asked to meet the person who cooked the dish. From here the story unfolded. The clattering of pans, the hiss of steam, and the frantic shouts of orders filled the kitchen of Le Chateau Moderne, one of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurants. It was a Friday evening, the kind of night when the tables were fully booked with CEOs, celebrities, and people who wielded more money than most could imagine. The air was thick with heat and tension. Inside this controlled chaos, a man moved slowly, deliberately, almost as though he didn't belong there. Thomas Reed, 68 years old, shuffled between counters carrying trays, chopping herbs, or wiping spills. His white chef's coat was pristine, but unlike the tailored fits of the younger chefs, his seemed a little too large, a little too plain. The others rarely spoke to him except to bark orders or laugh under their breath. He was the new hire. No, not really a chef, more like a kitchen hand, someone the head chef reluctantly accepted because management thought he might be cheap extra labor. "Hey, Grandpa," one of the sous chefs called out, smirking as he flipped a pan. "Don't trip over yourself. That sauce is worth more than your paycheck." Laughter rippled through the kitchen. Thomas simply nodded, lowering his gaze, and continued dicing onions with a calm precision. His hands trembled slightly, but the knife strokes were sharp, each cut uniform. No one noticed. No one cared. Out in the dining hall, the maitre d' was bustling nervously around a reserved table near the window. That table was different tonight. At precisely 7:45 p.m., a motorcade had stopped outside, and from it emerged a man whose very presence shifted the energy of the restaurant. Ethan Cole, billionaire tech magnate, founder of Cole Dynamics, and one of the most recognizable faces in America. Known for his visionary empire, but also for his fierce privacy, Ethan rarely dined in public. Tonight was an exception. The dining room hummed with whispers. "That's Ethan Cole. Why's he here? Isn't he supposed to be in Silicon Valley?" Ethan sat with two associates, both men in tailored suits, though their words hardly mattered. Ethan's focus was on the menu. He scanned it with a detached expression, then closed it. "I'll let the chef decide," he told the waiter simply. "Bring me whatever represents the heart of this restaurant." Back in the kitchen, the order arrived like a bolt of lightning. The head chef, Damien Leclerc, straightened his tall hat, his chest puffing with pride. "The billionaire wants me to show him what we are made of," Damien announced. "Prepare the signature courses. Risotto, truffle lamb, lobster bisque. Nothing less than perfection." The brigade moved with sharpened urgency. Every hand, every motion was calculated. Except Thomas. He lingered in the corner, washing herbs, almost invisible. But fate is strange. As the dishes began to assemble, one small plate remained incomplete, a side of roasted root vegetables, meant to complement the lamb. The young line cook responsible was in panic mode, juggling two other dishes. He groaned, shoved the tray toward Thomas, and sneered. "Old man, make yourself useful. Throw this together. Don't mess it up." He tossed down carrots, parsnips, and a handful of herbs. The others barely looked as Thomas quietly began peeling, chopping, seasoning. His movements were deliberate, almost meditative. He roasted the vegetables, glazed them lightly with butter and a touch of honey, then sprinkled a mix of thyme and rosemary, measured not by spoons, but by instinct, by feel. Finally, he added something no one noticed, a drizzle of reduced balsamic infused with orange zest. The aroma was faint but distinct. Minutes later, the plates left the kitchen, carried like treasures into the glowing dining hall. At the billionaire's table, Ethan Cole leaned back as the courses arrived. The lamb was carved beautifully, the risotto gleamed, the lobster bisque steamed with fragrant richness. He sampled each politely, nodding at the craft. Then, almost as an afterthought, he picked up his fork and tasted the side of roasted vegetables. The moment the flavors touched his tongue, something shifted. His hand froze midair. The noise of the restaurant dulled around him. The glaze, the herbs, the citrusy lift of the balsamic, it wasn't just food. It was memory. It was warmth. It was the echo of something long buried. Ethan put down his fork slowly. His two associates exchanged confused glances, but Ethan wasn't listening. He looked at the waiter. Who cooked this? His voice was calm, but it carried weight. The waiter blinked. The kitchen, sir. The vegetables are aside, prepared under Chef Damien. No. Ethan's eyes sharpened. Not Damien. Someone else. This dish doesn't belong with the others. This is different. Find out who made it. Now. The waiter stammered, nodded quickly, and hurried back. In the kitchen, confusion erupted when the waiter repeated the billionaire's demand. Damien turned red. Ridiculous. Everything came from me. I am the chef of this house. But the waiter shook his head nervously. He insists. He said this particular dish, it stands apart. He wants the one who made it. The line cooks exchanged uneasy glances. Then the guilty sous chef shrugged. Well, old man Reed threw it together. Every head turned toward Thomas. Silence fell over the kitchen. Damien's face contorted in fury. You let him touch the plate for Mr. Cole? Are you insane? But before anyone could stop him, the waiter had already rushed to fetch Thomas. Thomas stood awkwardly as he was led into the dining hall. His posture was stooped, his face lined with years, his gray hair cropped short. He looked painfully out of place among the glittering chandeliers, polished cutlery, and the billionaire who watched him with piercing eyes. Ethan gestured toward the chair across from him. Sit. Thomas hesitated, glancing back at the staff clustered at the kitchen door, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and mockery. But Ethan's tone was not one to refuse. Slowly, Thomas Saturday, this dish, Ethan said quietly, pointing at the nearly empty plate of roasted vegetables. It is yours, isn't it? Thomas's hands twitched. He lowered his gaze. Yes, sir. Only a side dish. Nothing special. Nothing special? Ethan leaned forward, his voice low, intense. Do you realize what this tastes like? Do you know what it carries? Thomas said nothing. He felt every eye in the room burning into him. The judgment of the chefs behind the glass door, the curiosity of the diners nearby. Ethan's face softened slightly. This isn't about technique. This is about soul. No ordinary cook could make this. Who are you? Thomas looked up then, meeting Ethan's gaze for the first time. His voice was quiet, almost trembling, but firm. My name is Thomas Reed. I used to cook, a long time ago. For a moment, neither man spoke. Around them, the restaurant carried on. Waiters moving, glasses clinking, laughter rising. But in that bubble of silence, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The rain tapped softly against the window of Thomas Reed's small apartment that night, long after the encounter with Ethan Cole. The old man sat alone at his kitchen table, the dim light above him casting shadows over a face carved by time. In front of him lay his hands, scarred, calloused, still steady despite their trembling moments. The billionaire's words echoed in his head. Who are you? For hours, Thomas could not sleep. Instead, memories long buried began to rise, as if the taste of roasted vegetables had unlocked a door he had nailed shut years ago. He remembered New York in 1987, when the city pulsed with ambition and hunger for the new. Down a cobblestone street in Soho, a restaurant sign gleamed in golden letters, Maison Reed. Behind its doors, a young Thomas commanded his kitchen like a general, his white jacket pristine, his dark hair slicked back, his eyes sharp with purpose. Fire table 7. Risotto up in 3. He barked, his voice carrying over the hiss of pans and the shouts of his brigade. The kitchen moved like an orchestra under his baton. At the pass, his wife Margaret moved with equal grace. She wasn't just his partner in life, but also in art. Where Thomas was intensity, Margaret was warmth. She plated dishes with a delicate touch, adding color, balance, and love. Diners often said they could taste her soul in every plate. Critics declared Maison Reed a revelation. Within a year, Thomas and Margaret held a Michelin-star, the youngest couple in America to do so. The restaurant was alive with energy, always packed, laughter echoing through its walls. He and Margaret would collapse into bed at dawn, exhausted but elated, whispering about new ideas. Cooking wasn't just their livelihood. It was their love story, served dish by dish. But dreams are fragile things. It was a winter night in 1993 when everything changed. The kitchen was full, orders pouring in, when a small fire started near the back stove. Grease, a forgotten rag, Thomas never knew. In seconds, the flames spread, devouring stainless steel and copper, licking across the ceiling. "Get out!" Thomas shouted, his brigade scattering in panic. But Margaret didn't run. She dashed toward the pantry, desperate to save their recipes, the journals filled with years of experiments, notes, dreams. Thomas screamed her name, pushing through smoke, but the fire was faster. The blast of heat knocked him back, and before his eyes, the restaurant, their life's work, collapsed into an inferno. Margaret never came out. They found him hours later in the alley, his hands burned, his voice gone raw from shouting. The papers called it tragedy. The critics mourned the loss of Maison Reed. But to Thomas, it wasn't just a restaurant that burned. It was his heart, his future, his reason to create. After Margaret's death, Thomas disappeared from the public eye. Invitations came, offers from investors to rebuild, but he turned them all away. He sold what remained, moved into a small apartment uptown, and for years, he didn't step foot in a professional kitchen. Cooking became something private, almost sacred. He still woke before dawn, chopping vegetables, stirring soups, roasting meats, but only for himself. Each dish was a whisper to Margaret, a prayer that maybe she could taste it somewhere beyond. His neighbors often smelled the aromas wafting through the hallway, but no one was ever invited in. The culinary world moved on. New names rose, young chefs dazzled the media, trends shifted. The name Thomas Reed faded like smoke. Occasionally, magazines wrote retrospectives. Whatever happened to the genius behind Maison Reed? But no one knew, and Thomas preferred it that way. To cook for the world again felt like betrayal. Margaret had been half of him. Without her, the plate was always incomplete. 2 decades passed this way, in silence and solitude. But as Thomas neared 70, something gnawed at him. He found himself wandering into restaurants, watching from the corner as young chefs shouted orders, flames leaping in their pans. His chest ached with longing. He missed the rhythm, the chaos, the fire. One morning, he walked past a help-wanted sign posted outside Le Chateau Moderne. The listing was for kitchen assistants, dishwashers, prep cooks, low-level staff. He stood there for nearly an hour, torn between shame and desire. Finally, he stepped inside. The manager looked at his resume, frowning. "You haven't worked in kitchens for over 20 years? And you're nearly 70? Thomas lowered his eyes. "I don't want anything fancy. Just let me be near the stoves again." Against his better judgment, the manager hired him. Cheap labor, he thought. The man wouldn't last a month. Thus Thomas Reed returned to the kitchen, not as master, but as servant. The young cooks mocked his age, joked about his slowness. They didn't know who he was. They didn't care. And Thomas didn't correct them. In truth, he was grateful just to hear the music of knives and fire again. Now, in his dim apartment, Thomas closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him. He could still see Margaret in the old kitchen, her laughter like music above the clang of pans. He could still smell the citrus glaze they had perfected together. It had been her idea, the orange zest. "It lifts the soul," she had said. And tonight, for the first time in decades, he had dared to use it again. His chest tightened. Had Ethan Cole truly recognized that? Or was it just coincidence? He didn't know. But when the billionaire had asked, "Who are you?" Thomas had felt something stir, a flicker in the ashes. He rose from the table and moved to the stove. Out of habit, he pulled out a pan, a handful of carrots, a sprig of thyme. His hands moved slower now, but the muscle memory was there. Chop, sauté, glaze. The air filled with the scent of orange and rosemary. For the first time in years, Thomas smiled faintly. And for the first time in years, he whispered Margaret's name without breaking. The morning after the fateful dinner, Ethan Cole sat alone in his penthouse office overlooking Central Park. The city sprawled beneath him like a living machine, a testament to the empire he had built. Yet his thoughts were not on business, not on stock prices or the launch of a new device. They were fixed firmly on a simple dish of roasted vegetables, and the old man who had cooked them. He could still taste it, The faint sweetness, the balance of herbs, the citrus note that struck him like a memory long forgotten. It wasn't just food. It was something far deeper, something that pulled at the seams of his carefully controlled life. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. And just like that, the skyscrapers of New York melted away, replaced by the small, cluttered kitchen of his childhood. Ethan was 8 years old then, a wiry boy with unkempt hair and clothes that rarely fit. His mother, Helen Cole, worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table after his father abandoned them. They lived in a tiny duplex outside Wichita, the walls thin, the roof often leaking. Life was hard, but Helen never let despair touch her son if she could help it. Her weapon was the kitchen. Every evening, no matter how exhausted she was, Helen cooked. Not extravagant meals, but dishes that carried warmth. Stews that simmered for hours, cornbread that filled the house with comfort, roasted vegetables from the modest garden she tended behind their home. Ethan often sat at the table, watching her move with quiet determination. Food isn't just for the stomach, Ethan, she would tell him. It's for the soul. You remember that. One summer, the local community center announced a free cooking workshop hosted by a rising chef from New York, part of an outreach program for struggling families. Helen signed up immediately, dragging Ethan along despite his protests. That was the first time Ethan met Thomas Reed. It was a humid afternoon, the center buzzing with families eager to learn. Thomas was in his 30s then, confident but approachable, his passion radiating through every word. He taught them simple techniques, how to bring out flavor from ordinary vegetables, how to elevate a dish with just a touch of zest or spice. Ethan remembered standing on a chair to see the counter as Thomas roasted carrots and parsnips, then drizzled them with a glaze of balsamic and orange. The aroma filled the room, and when Ethan tasted it, his eyes widened. It was unlike anything he had ever eaten. Simple, yes, but vibrant, alive. Helen smiled, watching her son devour the dish. See, Ethan, even the simplest things can be extraordinary. Thomas knelt down then, smiling at the boy. You've got a good palate, kid. Don't ever forget the power of a meal made with heart. It was a fleeting moment, a single afternoon, but it imprinted itself on Ethan's soul. For years afterward, his mother tried to replicate that recipe, adding her own touches. Every birthday, every special occasion, she made roasted root vegetables with citrus glaze. To Ethan, it became the taste of home, of love, of resilience in the face of hardship. When Ethan was 15, Helen passed away from an illness she had hidden for too long. Ethan was left alone, drifting through grief and poverty. But he carried her lessons with him, the memory of her voice, her cooking, and that single afternoon when a stranger named Thomas Reed had changed everything. He worked relentlessly, clawing his way through scholarships, coding late into the night, building small software projects that grew into companies. People called him a genius, but Ethan knew the truth. He had simply never stopped pushing, never stopped hungering for more. His mother's resilience lived in him, and her love gave him fuel. Yet despite the billions, the recognition, the world at his feet, something had always been missing. A piece of him remained that little boy at the community center, tasting roasted vegetables and believing in magic. Now, decades later, Ethan had tasted that same magic again. Not an imitation, not a memory, but the real thing. The dish Thomas Reed had cooked at Le Chateau Moderne was unmistakable. Ethan would bet his fortune on it. He opened his laptop, searching. Articles long archived appeared. Maison Reed, Michelin-starred husband and wife team, tragedy in 1993. Ethan's jaw tightened as he read about the fire, about Margaret's death, about Thomas vanishing into obscurity. So that was what had happened. That was why the world had lost a master. But Ethan hadn't lost him. Not yet. Later that evening, Ethan ordered his driver to take him to an address he had found, Thomas Reed's modest apartment in Harlem. The building was old, bricks weathered by time, the kind of place where no one would expect a legend to live. Thomas answered the door cautiously, surprised to see the billionaire standing in the dim hallway. His eyes widened slightly, then lowered. Mr. Cole. Ethan, the billionaire corrected. May I come in? The apartment was sparse but neat. Old pans hung on the wall, a bookshelf filled with worn cookbooks, photographs faded with age. On the stove, a pan of roasted vegetables still steamed faintly, their scent filling the room. Ethan inhaled deeply. It's the same. After all these years, it's exactly the same. Thomas sat at the table, uneasy. I only cook for myself these days. Nothing more. Ethan's gaze was firm, intense. You don't understand. That dish, you made it for me once, when I was a boy, at a community workshop in Kansas. You told me never to forget the power of a meal made with heart. I didn't. I never forgot. And now here you are. Thomas blinked, searching his memory. Slowly, recognition dawned. The boy on the chair. The wide-eyed taste of wonder. That was you. Ethan nodded. That was me. Silence filled the room, heavy with decades. For the first time in years, Thomas's heart stirred with something unfamiliar. Connection. Ethan leaned forward. Mr. Reed, Thomas, you're not finished. The world may have forgotten you, but I haven't. I need you. I want you to cook for me. Not just for me. For the people I trust, for moments that matter. I want to bring your gift back into the light. Thomas shook his head immediately, his voice rough. No. My time has passed. My hands are old, my fire burned out. I'm no one anymore. You're wrong, Ethan said firmly. Last night proved it. That flame is still there. And I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for heart. Thomas turned away, his eyes misting. Heart is what I lost. Ethan didn't argue further. He stood, placing a card on the table. When you're ready, call me. Because I promise you, Thomas, your story isn't over. As the billionaire left the apartment, Thomas sat in silence, the card glowing under the dim light. A part of him long buried stirred awake, uncertain, afraid, but undeniably alive. Thomas Reed woke the next morning with the business card still lying on the table beside him. The name Ethan Cole gleamed in embossed silver letters, the kind of card that carried weight far beyond its size. He turned it over in his hands again and again, but the more he stared at it, the heavier it seemed. For a long time, he simply sat there, unwilling to touch food, unwilling even to move, his thoughts a jumble of disbelief and dread. To the world, Ethan Cole was a billionaire visionary. To Thomas, he was now something far more dangerous, a mirror to the past, a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had buried. The restaurant was waiting. Lou's Chateau Moderne buzzed as usual that evening, but Thomas moved through the kitchen in silence, doing his menial tasks with a kind of mechanical detachment. The younger chefs still mocked him, tossing orders his way with smirks, whispering jokes just loud enough for him to hear. He endured them as he always did, with quiet humility. But tonight their words cut sharper. They had seen Ethan Cole notice him, had seen the billionaire's focus linger on a dish they all dismissed as nothing. And now, instead of respect, they resented him even more. Damien Leclerc, the head chef, was especially venomous, barking orders with extra cruelty, determined to make sure no one mistook Thomas's fleeting recognition as skill. When the shift ended, Thomas shuffled home. He lit a single lamp, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down. The apartment seemed emptier than ever. He could almost hear Margaret's voice urging him to answer Ethan, urging him to step back into the light. But then another voice rose in his mind, colder, sharper, reminding him of the night everything turned to ash, of his failure to protect the woman who had been his partner in life and in art. He closed his eyes and shook his head. No, he whispered to the empty room. That world is gone. I'm no one anymore. But Ethan Cole was not a man easily dismissed. 2 days later, he appeared again at the restaurant. He didn't announce himself, didn't demand attention. He simply sat at a table and waited. When Thomas emerged from the kitchen to bus a tray of dishes, their eyes met across the room. Ethan gave the faintest nod, as if to say, I'm still here. Thomas looked away quickly, his chest tightening. That evening, the billionaire left without speaking, but Thomas found another card slipped into his coat pocket. That night, Ethan came to his apartment again. This time Thomas tried to refuse him at the door, but Ethan's voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who had commanded boardrooms and presidents alike. Thomas, let me in. I'm not here for business. I'm here for you. Reluctantly, Thomas opened the door. The billionaire stepped inside, glancing around at the modest space, the worn cookware, the photos of a lifelong past. He spoke with conviction. You still have it. I know what I tasted. You think the world has forgotten, but I haven't. I want you to be my chef, not as a servant, but as an artist. You belong back in the kitchen where you can create again." Thomas turned away, gripping the back of a chair until his knuckles whitened. His voice trembled with anger and sorrow. "Belong? That word means nothing to me now. I had a place once. I had a kitchen, a partner, a life. It burned, and she burned with it. Do you understand that? The fire took more than my restaurant. It took my heart. And without her, there is no point. I'm an old man with shaking hands, fit only to chop onions in silence." Ethan did not flinch. "You're wrong. I tasted your heart on that plate. Margaret is gone. Yes, but she is still in every dish you make. You think you lost everything, but what you lost was not your gift. That's still alive." The words struck Thomas like a blow, and for a moment he almost believed them. He could feel the warmth of Margaret's laughter in his memory, see her smile as she drizzled orange zest over roasted carrots. But then shame overwhelmed him again, and he shook his head violently. "No, I won't do it. I can't. Don't you see? If I go back, I betray her. Without her, it isn't ours anymore. It's just me, and I'm nothing alone." Silence filled the room. Ethan studied him, the stubborn set of his shoulders, the pain in his eyes. Then the billionaire stood and placed a hand gently on the table. "You're not nothing. You're Thomas Reed, the man who inspired me when I had nothing. You gave me hope once, and now I want to give it back to you. But if you're not ready, I'll wait." He left the card on the table once more and departed into the night. Thomas collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Pride warred with grief inside him. He told himself he didn't need the billionaire, didn't need anyone. Yet his chest ached with longing, not just for Margaret, but for the fire he had abandoned. The next morning, as he shuffled back into the restaurant, he overheard the younger chefs gossiping. "Can you believe that billionaire? Asking for the old man. Must have been a fluke. No way he meant it." Their laughter stung more than it should have, but Thomas kept his head down. He would not show them weakness. He would not show anyone. Still, at night when he cooked alone, he found himself experimenting again, his hands rediscovering old rhythms, his mind remembering flavors long dormant. Every dish carried Margaret's ghost, and every dish whispered to him that perhaps, just perhaps, he was not finished. But he could not accept Ethan's offer. Not yet. Pride told him it was impossible. Grief told him it was betrayal. Fear told him he was too old, too broken. So he sat in his apartment night after night, staring at the business card, torn between the ashes of the past and the faint, dangerous spark of something new. For the first time in decades, Thomas Reed felt the fire stir inside him, but he did not know whether to feed it or let it die forever. The days that followed were restless for Thomas Reed. He carried Ethan Cole's card in his pocket, unable to throw it away, yet terrified to use it. Every time his hand brushed against it, memories surged. Margaret's smile, the fire that consumed their restaurant, the silence that followed for decades. Each night, he cooked alone in his apartment, dishes meant only for him. But with every chop of the knife and every stir of the pan, he felt something pulling at him. The flame that had been buried deep inside flickered, timid at first, then brighter with every breath of memory. One evening, after another long shift at Le Chateau Moderne filled with taunts and mockery from the younger chefs, Thomas returned home more weary than usual. He dropped his coat on the chair, pulled out the card, and placed it on the counter. The embossed letters gleamed under the light. He stared at it until his eyes blurred. Slowly, almost against his will, he reached for a pan and began cooking. This time, it wasn't the simple vegetables he often made. He reached deeper, pulling recipes from the corners of his mind that he had sworn never to touch again. His hands trembled as he worked, but his movements carried a familiar rhythm. Olive oil sizzled, garlic bloomed, herbs released their fragrance. He roasted lamb, prepared risotto, and crafted a citrus glaze that filled the apartment with a warmth he hadn't felt in decades. When he finally sat down, he didn't eat immediately. He stared at the plate, at the way the light caught the glaze, at the delicate balance of color and shape. Margaret's voice echoed in his ears. "Cooking is not about perfection, Thomas. It's about heart." His chest ached, and for the first time in years, he whispered aloud, "If you can see me now, Maggie, I'm trying." The following week, Ethan Cole returned to the restaurant. He did not ask for Thomas directly this time. Instead, he left a message with the maitre d', a quiet invitation to a private dinner. Thomas almost refused immediately, but something stopped him. The words of Margaret, the faint flicker of pride, the taste of the dish he had made for himself. It all coiled together until he found himself nodding. The date was set. The days leading up to the dinner were both torment and salvation. Thomas rose before dawn, buying fresh ingredients from the markets, testing recipes in his small kitchen until his counters were cluttered with scraps and stains. His hands were unsteady, his back ached, but his spirit fought through the pain. Every mistake pushed him harder. Every small victory reminded him of who he once was. For the first time in years, his knives sang against the cutting board. His neighbors smelled aromas drifting through the hallways and murmured in surprise. Some knocked on his door, curious, but Thomas never answered. This was private. This was sacred. On the night of the dinner, Thomas dressed carefully. His chef's coat, long stored away, was pressed clean. It no longer fit perfectly, hanging looser on his thin frame. But when he looked at himself in the mirror, he saw not a broken old man, but a chef again. His reflection startled him. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to see that part of him. He gathered his knives, wrapped them in cloth, and carried them to the private venue Ethan had arranged. The room was intimate, lit by soft golden lamps. A long table stretched across the space, set with immaculate crystal and silver. Ethan was already there, waiting with a few close associates, men and women whose wealth and influence stretched across the globe. They rose politely when Thomas entered, but it was Ethan's expression that mattered most. The billionaire smiled, not with triumph, but with gratitude. "I'm glad you came." Thomas bowed slightly. "I almost didn't." "But you did," Ethan replied simply. "And that's enough." Thomas set to work in the adjoining kitchen. His hands shook as he unpacked his knives, but once the first blade struck the cutting board, muscle memory carried him. He moved slowly at first, then with growing confidence. Flames roared in pans, steam curled from pots, and soon the kitchen filled with the rhythm he had long missed. The scents were intoxicating: truffle and garlic, rosemary and thyme, citrus and balsamic. He plated each dish with care, his eyes narrowing with focus, his heart pounding in his chest. It was as though Margaret stood beside him, guiding his hand. The first course went out, a delicate soup infused with fennel and saffron. Then came the risotto, creamy and rich, each grain perfectly tender. The main course was lamb, roasted to perfection, accompanied by the root vegetables and citrus glaze that had started it all. Finally, a dessert of poached pears with honey and cinnamon closed the meal. Each dish carried not only flavor, but memory. Each plate a story told in colors and textures. As Thomas delivered the final dish, he stepped back, wiping his brow with the sleeve of his coat. He watched as Ethan and his guests tasted, their eyes widening, their conversations pausing. Murmurs of astonishment rippled across the table. Ethan himself took a slow bite of the lamb and closed his eyes, his expression softening into something that was not just appreciation, but reverence. When he opened them again, his gaze locked on Thomas. "This," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "is not just food. This is history. This is love. This is soul." Applause rose around the table. The guests, powerful people who were not easily impressed, clapped with genuine admiration. Thomas bowed his head, overwhelmed. He felt his chest tighten, not with grief this time, but with release. For the first time since the fire, he felt alive. He felt whole. After the dinner, Ethan approached him privately. "Thomas," he said, "I don't just want you to cook for me. I want the world to see you again. Come with me. Travel with me. Let your gift shine where it belongs. You've given me back a part of my past, and I want to give you back your future." Thomas's throat tightened. He could barely speak. For so long, he had believed himself finished, a relic of a forgotten era. Yet tonight, in this small room, he had proven otherwise. Margaret's memory had not chained him. It had carried him. He closed his eyes, inhaling the lingering aroma of herbs and citrus, and whispered softly, perhaps it's time." That night, as he walked home under the glow of the city lights, Thomas felt something he had not felt in decades. It was not just pride, not just relief. It was fire, rekindled, burning steady and strong within him. For the first time, He no longer feared the past. For the first time, he dared to imagine tomorrow. Thomas Reed stood at the window of his small apartment, watching the dawn spill across the skyline. For decades, mornings had meant solitude, the ritual of chopping and stirring in silence. But now, the city outside felt different, alive in a way it hadn't in years. The dinner with Ethan Cole and his guests had lit a fire inside him that refused to fade. He had tried to push it down, tried to tell himself that it was only a fleeting moment, but his heart betrayed him. He was no longer content with shadows. For the first time in years, he wanted to live in the light again. When Ethan called him the next day, Thomas answered. The billionaire's voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of a man who knew the value of persistence. Thomas, he said, the world needs to taste what I tasted. You don't have to do it alone. Let me help you. Thomas hesitated, gripping the phone tightly. He thought of Margaret, of the fire, of all the years he had buried himself in silence. But then he remembered her words, remembered how she had always told him that cooking was about heart, not perfection. She would not want him to die with his gift locked away. She would want him to share it, to pass it on. With a deep breath, Thomas whispered, yes. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Ethan arranged for Thomas to join him on his travels, cooking for private gatherings of leaders, artists, and dreamers. At first, Thomas was nervous, his hands trembling as he stepped into grand kitchens filled with strangers. But each time he plated a dish, each time he saw the spark in the eyes of those who tasted his food, his confidence grew. His name, once forgotten, began to spread quietly through whispers in high circles. Thomas Reed, the lost master, was back. But Thomas did not seek fame. What mattered to him was something deeper. On one of their trips, while walking through a community center in Chicago, he saw children gathered around a volunteer struggling to teach them basic cooking. Their eyes were wide, curious, eager, but the tools were poor, the lessons rushed. Something stirred in Thomas's chest. He remembered Ethan as a boy, perched on a chair at a workshop, tasting roasted carrots for the first time. He remembered Margaret's smile as she said, "Food can lift the soul." That evening, Thomas spoke to Ethan. "I want to do more than cook for the powerful. I want to give back. I want to teach." Ethan smiled. "Then let's do it." Together, they founded a program that offered free cooking classes for children in underprivileged communities. Thomas taught them not just recipes, but the philosophy that had defined his life. Respect the ingredients, honor the process, and above all, cook with heart. At first, the children giggled at the old man with his stern eyes and trembling hands. But soon they grew captivated by the way he transformed simple vegetables into feasts. He taught them how to chop safely, how to balance flavors, how to trust their instincts. He made them taste, close their eyes, and describe what they felt, not just what they ate. The classroom filled with laughter, with curiosity, with pride. One afternoon, as Thomas guided a little girl's hands on the knife, helping her slice an apple thin, he looked up and saw Ethan standing quietly in the doorway. The billionaire was smiling, his eyes softer than Thomas had ever seen them. After the lesson, Ethan approached him. "This," he said, gesturing at the children, "this is your legacy. Not just what you put on a plate, but what you leave in their hearts." Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. For years, he had believed his legacy was ash. Now, in the laughter of children, he saw that it was alive again. Word spread, and soon more centers asked for his guidance. Thomas traveled, not for prestige, but for purpose. In every city, children waited eagerly, and in every lesson, Margaret's spirit was with him. He no longer felt haunted by her absence. He felt carried by her presence. Cooking had once been their love story. Now it was his way of honoring her, of keeping her alive through the joy he gave others. Months later, Ethan hosted a private gala, not for business, but for celebration. Leaders, philanthropists, and families from the community centers gathered in a hall lit with warm golden light. At the center was a long table filled with dishes prepared by Thomas and his young students. The children beamed with pride as they served roasted vegetables, soups, breads, and desserts they had learned to make. The air buzzed with laughter and gratitude. When the meal ended, Ethan stood and raised a glass. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate not just food, but heart." We celebrate Thomas Reed, who showed us that true talent never fades, that loss does not erase love, and that even from ashes, fire can rise again. The room erupted in applause. Thomas, standing at the far end of the table, bowed his head, tears slipping down his cheeks. He had never sought this, never wanted glory again. But what he felt now was not glory. It was peace. Later, as the guests departed and the hall grew quiet, Thomas remained in the kitchen with the children, helping them wash dishes, laughing softly at their chatter. One of the boys tugged at his sleeve. "Chef Reed," he asked shyly, Do you think I could be a real chef one day?" Thomas knelt, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. His voice was steady, warm. "You already are. Every time you cook with love, you are a real chef." That night, as he walked home under the stars, Thomas felt Margaret beside him. Not as a wound, not as a ghost, but as a presence walking with him, proud of the man he had become. He was no longer the forgotten chef, no longer the man who hid from fire and grief. He was a teacher, a guide, a flame passed on to the next generation. In the quiet of his apartment, he sat at his table once more. But this time, he wasn't alone. The echoes of laughter lingered in his ears. The memory of eager faces filled the room. He picked up his knife, chopped an onion, and smiled. Tomorrow, and the tomorrow after that, there would always be another table to set, another soul to lift, another fire to kindle. For Thomas Reed, the story was not an ending, but a beginning. A table for tomorrow, waiting to be filled.